So good morning, everybody. Um, I'm Greg Wynn. I'm Vice President of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and I'm also Chair of the Theodore Roosevelt Association's annual book prize. The first thing I want to say is this is a pilot event for the TRA and its staff in putting this together. And technologically, it's been good training for us. So I apologize in advance and take all responsibility for any glitches in anybody's ability to join or otherwise participate in this. But I want to thank everyone that has signed up and has joined us here this morning. And I want to give a special thanks in particular to Dave Foltz and Marie Kutch in our Oyster Bay office, and Dave out of Dallas, who spent a lot of time both messaging the membership and also setting this up technologically. So thanks to both of them. I want to welcome also Vice Admiral retired Dave Architzel, the chair of the TRA, who is here this morning as well, and our CEO, Howard Ehrlich, who has also joined us from Oyster Bay. And again, most importantly, thank you all for participating. And I'm also very pleased to welcome our two guests, especially Dr. Jack Thompson and Ms. Susan Ferber, and I will give you some more background on them shortly. But just real briefly, I'd like to go through some mechanics in administrivia for this morning's session. Namely, we are going to run about an hour, and there is some leeway to run a few minutes over that time, but I am sensitive to our guest time. So we'll try and round it up and finish off around 11 o'clock. I am going to moderate a chat between myself, Jack, and Susan for about 30 minutes or so. And when it seems right to transition, we'll go to a question and answer session, which I will host, or rather will hand off to the competent hands of Howard Ehrlich, who will manage the questions and answers for the next 30 minutes or so. You can, at the top of your Zoom screen, hopefully see a Q&A tab, which you can click onto and then type your questions, which will be seen by Howard, and he'll choose the ones that will be read to either Jack or Susan, or get a response from both perhaps. So that's kind of how this morning is gonna flow. Feel free to type your questions ahead of time, because that gives Howard a little bit more time as we go through our first 30 minutes or so of the chat for Howard to start sorting questions in real time, so that there's not any kind of lag as we go through the Q&A session, and we can maximize our time. So without further ado, I want to first introduce Dr. Jack Thompson, who is a senior strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and he is joining us from the Netherlands. And for our purposes today in particular, he is the author of this past year's TRA Annual Book Prize for the most significant book written about Theodore Roosevelt, for his book, Great Power Rising, Theodore Roosevelt in the Politics of U.S. Foreign Policy. And then Susan Ferber, his editor at the Oxford University Press, is joining us from Long Island. So it's great to have her involved in this as well, because as anyone knows from the literary world, editors are very much enmeshed in the production and development of a book, right from its genesis all the way up through publication and after. Testimony to her being here today, and we appreciate it. And just an interesting note about Susan is she's a TR enthusiast herself, and she volunteered 2 days a week after college at the curatorial department of Sagamore Hill, cataloging the Roosevelt Library's books, which I'm envious of. So being a book lover, and I have a particular interest in TR related books. So with all of that covered, I want to welcome both Jack and Susan, and thank you for being here. So Jack, my first question for you is, what was the draw for you initially? Was it foreign policy or TR or something else?
I mean, so the real answer is it was kind of a long, convoluted, confusing process, because all first-time authors, or the vast majority of first-time authors, have no idea what they're doing and don't really understand kind of what they're getting themselves in for. But to make this sound a little bit nicer, basically, what I discovered kind of pretty early on when I was starting to think about because this started first as an MA thesis paper, basically, then became a PhD thesis, and then only much later became a book. What I realized fairly early on was that Theodore Roosevelt was really a fantastic vehicle for trying to understand how kind of the domestic side of the US political system influences US foreign policy, and also kind of the reverse part of that process, kind of how what happens abroad kind of influences US politics, and kind of this two-way street between the two. And Theodore Roosevelt, there are plenty of historians who have kind of noticed this and written about it a little bit, but no one had ever actually sat down and tried to tell the whole story. So, I mean, really kind of by accident, I stumbled into kind of how great TR is. I mean, just across the board, but especially kind of in this area of the linkages between US domestic politics and US foreign policy.
Interesting. So before we get into any more about your book or your research, I just want to ask you, if you would, just tell us a little bit about your background and your current role, which sounds intriguing to me, at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies.
So I actually trained as a historian originally. I did a PhD in the UK at the University of Cambridge, and then worked as an academic historian for several years. Loved teaching, loved writing, but for a variety of reasons decided to move to the think tank world. I spent 3.5 years in Switzerland working at the main kind of international security think tank in Zurich. And then about a year ago moved to The Hague, where I basically do two things at the HCSS. First, I co-chair an initiative on the future of transatlantic relations. And second, I run our strategic foresight program. And so in practice, that means I work pretty closely with the Dutch Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to think through kind of all the big changes that are happening in international politics right now.
Interesting. And how does somebody get a position like that? How did you kind of get?
Yeah, that's a good question. Dumb luck. I mean, there are very few jobs for not to discourage people from going into the social sciences, the humanities, but there just aren't that many jobs in these areas. And it's just a combination of I had the right background in terms of foreign language ability, and kind of an interest in both kind of the academic side of history and contemporary events, but also very interested in policy. I did a master's degree at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And kind of the 2 years I spent there, I think really just kind of imbued me with just a fascination with policy. And I guess that's probably one of the reasons why I ended up in the think tank world, is I'm really interested in kind of working with and advising policymakers on kind of all the big decisions they have to make.
And how long is the position? Is it a fixed term, so to speak, or?
No, it's a long-term position. So we'll see.
Yeah, you've unpacked your bags, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, I've unpacked my bags.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, along the same lines, now turning back to your book, but as far as foreign relations go, I noted throughout the book and in the bibliography that you consulted some interesting foreign sources during the course of your research. If you don't mind, if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, because it's an area that a lot of researchers don't go down for any number of reasons.
I mean, traditionally, in studying kind of the history of U.S. foreign policy, I mean, there were always historians who brought kind of foreign sources into their work, but it wasn't necessarily something that was expected or really emphasized. I would say in the last 10, 20 years or so, and Susan knows more about this than I do, but in maybe the last 10, 20 years or so, there's been this move to kind of internationalize the study of the history of U.S. foreign policy, history of U.S. foreign relations. And so, I mean, it's just kind of normal. I think it's not in every case, but in many cases, if the opportunity arises, if it's appropriate, there is this kind of expectation that you should at least think about including foreign sources. In my case, it was maybe a bit easier than some other historians who work on U.S. foreign relations, because I've spent a good part of the last 20 years living in Europe. So in my case, It wasn't that difficult to go to the UK and to go to Germany to access some archival stuff there. And I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. But it worked out well for me being based in Europe to access those different archives.
And did you say you speak you have multiple language that you speak, correct? So that probably helped too, and is also a deterrent to other researchers.
Sure. Well, exactly. I mean, it's fine to say, oh, I'm going to go do research in Russian or Arabic or whatever. But to reach a level of language ability that allows you to actually do that in an efficient manner and an effective manner is easier said than done. So I was fortunate. My father was in the Air Force when I was younger, so we lived in Germany. We were stationed in Germany for a few years. So I always had an interest in learning German. I studied it all kind of as I was growing up in school. I did an exchange program in Germany for a year when I was at university. And now that I'm based in Europe, it's been a bit easier to continue with the German. And also my wife is from the Czech Republic. So when you live in Europe, when you live in a multilingual family, it becomes kind of a habit you learn languages. It's very time consuming, but it's rewarding as well.
Yeah, I think your use of the foreign sources was really terrific, and so that's a great response and appreciate it. Hopefully some folks have got some questions, because I think there's some uncharted territory there to ask you about, because particularly with Theodore Roosevelt being the internationalist that he was, there's a lot of ground that can be covered with foreign reporting and foreign sources that, for whatever reason, researchers have yet to kind of dig into. But Susan, I'm just going to take the opportunity. Jack had mentioned about the shift in historical research, now looking more broadly from an international perspective, and that being appealing. Do you want to comment on that from a publisher's perspective?
Sure. I mean, I work on a list at Oxford University Press that's American and world history, and Americanists tend to, see the beginnings and the ends of their history in terms of a very exceptional point of view. And I think that absolutely comes through in, the textbooks that kids get in school. But the field itself, I think, has begun moving, and it's slow, and it will never be everybody. But thinking beyond the American borders, that seeing the United States from foreign eyes and seeing the world through American eyes, these are natural processes. This is what's going on all of the time. And I think it's particularly true in the period that, Jack is writing about, that America becomes a growing global power. And that is absolutely related to Theodore Roosevelt. But historians, I think, need to take that very seriously. It does matter what's happening in the United States, in other parts of the world, and it matters what's happening in other parts of the world in terms of the way Americans are thinking about things. So it's been one trend that I have, I think, worked hard to try to bring to the history list that I edit. But I also edit a series in international history, and many of the books of that series don't have the United States as a player. So, you can write really strong global history and international history without the US, but it seems always to be a point of reference. And so I think about this a lot. What Jack said about language skills is absolutely true. It's just harder. We don't learn as many languages in the US. People aren't necessarily as fluent. It costs more to travel. I think at a time when the borders are closed to people, it really is much trickier to think about what the world of research will look like going forward to ensure that this very important trend continues.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thanks. And hopefully we get some questions along those lines too. I want to toss one back over to Jack. So since we're talking foreign policy, now in the world in which I operate within the Department of Defense and the whole of government, quite frankly, great power competition is very much in vogue. The whole concept of the strategic chessboard, right, amongst great powers, which for you could almost argue a quarter of a century or more, that concept was kind of pushed under the table as we countered violent extremists, and et cetera, et cetera. So anytime now, because of my background on Theodore Roosevelt, I hear great power competition, I immediately think of Theodore Roosevelt and what he did with the United States and how he viewed that strategic chessboard. So I'm going to ask you, with great power competition very much a reality now in China, being seen as one of the primary competitors or adversary. TR understood this global dynamic. Are there lessons to be learned based on your writing and your research?
I mean, of course, history is always a useful, I don't want to say guide. History always provides really useful context for thinking about kind of these contemporary problems. The challenge when you're trying to draw on kind of the history of US foreign policy to understand what's happening in terms of kind of the great power competition that you're talking about now is that the dynamic was different in TR's time. In TR's time, the US was still kind of on the rise. The trajectory was still upward. Now, it's not to say that the US is in decline. That's a whole debate that, you know, I don't really want to get into. But it's certainly true that the US is no longer kind of a rapidly rising power. It's now maybe more of a plateaued power. Whereas China, if we're talking specifically about China, China is the country that's still kind of rising, getting stronger. So, I mean, there's certainly plenty of kind of lessons that you can take. There's still plenty of lessons you can take from TR's time. The need to, I mean, one of the things that TR was really good about, and is one of the ways in which he might serve as a useful guide, is his ability, the fact that he very astutely sought to position the US. He was very conscious of and understood kind of the complexity of the geopolitics of his time. And we are, I mean, after, you know, most of the Cold War was essentially kind of a bipolar picture where you had the US and the Soviet Union, those are the two main powers. For a decade or so after the end of the Cold War, the US was a unipolar system where the US was really the only kind of major great power. And now, once again, we have kind of a multipolar system. You have lots of different, the power is more diverse. And that's kind of the same type of geopolitical context in which TR was operating. And he was very skillful at kind of working the different levers of that complicated system, both in terms of his personal relationships with important diplomats, important leaders from around the world, but also kind of thinking a bit more broadly about kind of the entire chessboard, so to speak, and kind of the US's place on that chessboard and how to leverage the advantages that the US enjoyed to promote US interests.
So I'm going to throw you kind of a oddball one, but you know, it's the parlor game amongst historians, I suppose, the great event theory of history or the great person theory of history, right? Which drives the course of events. And so what are your thoughts? If Theodore Roosevelt had not become president, the internationalist that he was, would the rise or the arc of America's prominence on the world stage have been different? Or do you think he drove that, or do you think events drove that? I'm just curious to know kind of your back of the bar napkin thoughts on that one.
So like every historian, I'm going to say, well, it's some of both, Greg. No, but really, I mean, I think I would say that kind of the structural factors were such that the US would have ended up in the same spots. I think the interesting thing about TR is he and a few others kind of in his small circle, they recognized earlier than most Americans kind of the potential and were pretty aggressive and I think mostly successful in pushing the US to kind of maybe accelerate a little bit some of the things that helped the US's rise. And I think, I mean, that's why I think we saw kind of the US start to peak, maybe right around the second half of the 1890s, and kind of stay in that peak during TR's tenure, and also obviously with Woodrow Wilson in World War I. But then you also had this period in the 1920s and the 1930s where a lot of Americans, I mean, it was clear from a political culture standpoint, many Americans weren't really ready for the type of never-ending geopolitical competition that TR thought was appropriate.
Yeah.
So it's both
Yeah.
the structural side and the personal side.
Interesting. Thanks for that. You know, just switching gears a little bit now looking at your book through a different lens. So in addition to the foreign resources that you used, you also used newspapers fairly extensively. And while historians have always used, and particularly biographers of Theodore Roosevelt, love primary accounts, newspaper accounts from the period, at least in my opinion, you made the interesting connection between newspapers and how they shaped TR's approach to foreign policy. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I've got a follow-on question for you along those lines.
Sure. So for historians who are looking at this question of public opinion and foreign policy, basically kind of after the 1930s, they have increasingly sophisticated opinion polling data to draw on. So they can find the relevant poll, pull out the numbers and say, okay, this is what public opinion was at any given time. For TR's time, it's a slightly more complicated process because there was no real opinion, there was no opinion polling at that point. And so you're kind of left with kind of less direct tools to use. But one of the things I realized as I really started to dig into kind of, the newspapers of the time and to get a feel for how TR used the newspapers is there was, as you rightly say, there was this fascinating kind of two-way street. TR was truly, a genius when it came to publicizing himself, publicizing his agenda, and used kind of the news and was very good at kind of figuring out how to get newspapers to cover what he was doing in the way that he wanted them to cover it. But he was also inevitably also shaped by not just the newspaper coverage overall, but the individuals working in the newspaper industry. He was very close friends with a ton of people in the newspaper world. And some of that was calculation. He was a very shrewd guy who was not at all averse to thinking kind of strategically about the relationships he had with people. But there was also, and this is one of the fun things about TR is alongside kind of the crafty, at times cynical political operator, there's also kind of this just intellectually curious guy who loved working with journalists, who loved kind of the world of newspapers, loved interacting with journalists and with editors. You see that especially kind of in his pre-presidential correspondence, where he's interacting with these journalists, and it was often, you had to look closely sometimes to figure out whether this was kind of TR the idealist, working closely with young idealist reporters who were trying to maybe clean up New York City or whatever, or whether it was TR the politician who was trying to sweet talk some reporter into covering whatever thing he was working on or whatever office he was running for in a more favorable light. And so there's always kind of this two-level dynamic with TR and his interactions with journalists and with editors that was just an absolute joy to kind of follow as I was, during the years when I was doing the archival research.
Yeah, it's a couple things come to mind, at least for me, from listening to your response to that. Is he was politics was one of the great loves of his life, and he was a masterful politician. He understood the way that the machinery of government worked. And nowadays we think of a politician or a bureaucrat as sort of patronizing or condescending terms, right? Oh, he's a politician or he's a bureaucrat. But Theodore Roosevelt was both in a lot of ways. He was Civil Service Commissioner of the United States for 8 years, I think, under two Republican and a Democratic president, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He held executive positions and positions in the legislative branch as New York State Assemblyman. So he understood the levers of power and compromise. But I think as part of that, and as you said, his relationship with the media was very, very carefully honed by him, and he used it to his advantage. I know that a lot of folks may not know, but newspapers, particularly prior to the turn of the century, were very often aligned with. They were not shy about their political bias. Now there is sort of this understood that there may be a bias or even a pronounced bias, but they claim to not have a bias, right? That was not always the case. Very often papers were called the Democratic so-and-so or the Republican so-and-so. And I know TR very often influenced editors, like you said, to publish certain things or republish certain things from other papers for his advantage.
Yeah,
so, Yeah, well, I was going to say, so my follow-on question is talking about public media and that sort of thing and newspapers. Do you see any sort of lessons, again, lessons learned, or lessons derived from this to social media today? Of course, we just ended an administration that used social media, however you want to classify it, they used it very aggressively. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really complicated question. It's one that I haven't really been able to had time to think through yet. A couple of things. So on one hand, the tools change, but the basic kind of, politics fundamentally doesn't change. So just like TR was very astute in using kind of the tools of his time, primarily kind of newspaper coverage and public speeches to his advantage. Politicians today are or at least the effect, the successful politicians are very astute at using still kind of, so-called old media, newspapers, TV, whatever, but also social media as well. They're effective at using social media to advance both kind of their policy agendas, but also kind of their own political fortunes. So on the one hand, we're more than a century down the road, and kind of politicians are still being politicians. That said, social media gives, it's a different, things like, obviously for the last 4 years, Twitter and Facebook have been particularly important in terms of how politicians operate politically. And we are still figuring out what role these platforms play in our political culture. We see Congress grappling with this. It's one of the few big issues that kind of, you see kind of, it mixes up the partisan divide. You see both Democrats and Republicans expressing strong concern about this. And you also see both Democrats and Republicans who are at least kind of behind the scenes, working very closely with these new platforms. So I think it's too early to say, this is what this means, and this is what we can say. Yeah, I'll leave it there because I need to think this through. And I don't have any big ideas about this yet.
No, thanks. That's fair. I appreciate the insight. I've got a few questions for Susan, but I just want to ask you one more. And that is, what do you find most appealing about TR, just in general, and also the least appealing? You're probably not going to hurt anybody's feelings.
So I think both as a historian and as an American, the thing I really appreciate, there are many things to appreciate about a TR. It could be a long list, but one thing that kind of comes to mind at the moment is the fact that he was both a very shrewd and at times cynical political operator, but he was also incredibly idealistic. And he never, I think unlike a lot of politicians kind of as they advance in their career, he never fully lost sight of that idealism. So that's a tough balance to keep kind of once you reach kind of the heights that he did. And I think given the nature of the US political system, to be successful as president, it's very difficult to truly succeed unless you can both be kind of shrewd and hard-nosed and calculating, but at the same time not truly believe in kind of the American experiment, truly believe that that US institutions, that kind of believe in kind of the specialness of American democracy. A lot of politicians kind of stumble, especially on that second one. And so to be able to combine those two, of course, he had his low points, which we can talk about. And I'll mention one in a minute. But overall, if you look at kind of the entirety of his career, he managed to kind of hold on to both of those kind of aspects of being a politician. And I think that's in many ways kind of one of the keys to success in the US presidency, which, is many US presidents have failed on one or even both of those scores. Now, something that I don't like about TR. I think that maybe the most important thing to point out here would be kind of some of the stumbles that occurred in the last decade of his life, in the last decade of his career. They were the same thing. He, for all of his idealism in kind of the American system, his belief in the specialness of the American system, during World War I, as he was kind of wandering in the political wilderness for a couple of years, trying to figure out how to get back into power, trying to figure out if maybe kind of things had passed him by. He stumbled a couple of times, and did things that I think a younger TR would have found pretty disappointing, and which I suspect probably secretly he himself found disappointing. He demonized German Americans in ways that at the time he excused, but I think, I think we can say kind of in retrospect, we're pretty irresponsible. And he demonized anti-war activists, again, in ways that were really not responsible. And he also, and finally, he suggested some things that if they had been implemented would have been pretty profoundly anti-democratic. And so, I mean, that's just a way of saying that even someone like TR, who's, undoubtedly one of the great presidents we've ever had, he had his stumbles as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, just to round that off, for whatever my opinion's worth, and you mentioned idealism, I think one of the strongest elements of his idealism, which at least in the past year or so, that has been reinforced in my mind, has been his idealism for the potential of America, right? He was constantly talking about that. It was not that we have created this great shining city on the hill, to use Reagan's term, and it is, but we've got room to grow yet, and we're still getting better, and we aren't there. So very often TR reinforced in his writing and in his comments the potential, where we go from here, and that everybody's got to play a role in it. So yeah, thanks for that. So Susan, I just want to turn to you, and ask you, as Jack's editor for this great book, can you just tell us a bit about your role for those that the uninitiated perhaps, and both as an editor and as an advocate for the book?
Sure, thank you. So I was trying to look back to see exactly when Jack's book first came on my radar and how. And as an acquisitions editor, I see projects from all different places. They come to me different ways. And I honestly can't remember if he's just sent me a proposal, like a cold proposal through the email, which happens, many times a day, in my life, or if I had also heard about the project because I knew some people at Cambridge who had worked with him, including his own advisor, John Thompson. So we actually have an author whose name is John Thompson and an advisor whose name is John Thompson. And I thought that was pretty funny. But I also knew some people that he had studied US history with. And so I can't remember if they also mentioned Jack's project to me, but I'm sure that what I did was read through his proposal, because I have that, and think there's something promising here and something that's a really good match with my list. I do a lot of books on US foreign relations. I am very fascinated by the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I work on books about American presidents, and as you already said, I have a soft spot for Theodore Roosevelt. So between my academic interests, by thinking about the fit with the Oxford University Press list, and then, I spend years working on projects. If I'm not interested in them, that's a really tough thing to do. So we have a process of peer review at university presses. So it's not just me saying, I'd love to do this book, but me going to scholars and asking for their critical assessments, getting that feedback, bringing it to the authors so that they can revise, and then working on the manuscripts with them to ensure that they are the strongest that they can be before they go into production. It's a big team effort to make a book. So, there are people in production and marketing and publicity and sales, doing all kinds of things behind the scenes in order to actually have the physical book or the electronic book that you're looking at. So that's the process that happened with Jack's book. And, it was not unusual in my experience to work with someone who has a PhD and is doing something that's not a tenure track, career role in the university world. But I also knew that Jack had a strong interest in the in the actual practical foreign relations parts of what he was writing about. And you know, he is somebody who unusually bridges those and had actually done an edited volume on related topics, but it wasn't a history book. And this one was the real archival history book, which is my great love.
And you are, by the way, if I did not mention it, at Oxford University Press, and correct?
Correct. I work
Yeah.
in the New York office of Oxford University Press.
And so how long does it take from a book to go from that initial, let's discuss this idea, to publication typically?
Well, there is no typical. I mean, I see proposals for projects that have not been written at all. So in some cases, you know, that's 20 years. In other cases, and I think this is more traditional for something that started off as a revised dissertation or something that existed in one form and then, you know, morphed into the first book manuscript, I would say maybe 2 to 3 years is average, but I'm not sure there's any average. I mean, all of my authors are on different personal and professional tracks. And so, you know, at the same year that Jack's book came out, I published a book that had been signed 36 years earlier. So I never know what it's going to be. It's very much a case where it has to be what the author needs that to be. And a lot of people have a fairly substantial amount of intellectual thinking to do beyond dissertation stage to create something that is a real book manuscript and not simply the sort of output of a university that appeals to a committee of, let's say, 5 advisors. So I think many of my authors, you know, are the beneficiaries of time, you know, the ability to make the best book that they can write. And I'm fortunate that I work at a company that's been around since 1478. So I can always say, we've got time, you know, we've been doing this for a few centuries. You know, if it's 6 months or a year or whatever it is, you know, if it's 5 years, it's all right. I'm always going to have books on my list. It's what will make the best book you can write.
Was Jack a difficult author?
Definitely not. No.
Because I'm
from Wisconsin. We don't know how to be difficult in Wisconsin. We're too polite.
Yeah, I'm sure you've encountered some. But what are you working on now? If you can tell us briefly anything that of maybe a particular interest.
Oh, that's a really good question because I have about 14 manuscripts I should be editing right now. You know, my list is so varied that you know, there can be a year where I don't have anything in this period, and there can be a year where I have lots of books, you know, that seem to be on the turn of the century. One book that I'm working on right now that I'm like really deeply immersed in at this very moment is about clothing and law and politics in the United States, which are not things that you generally put together. And the book very much looks at the fact that women, slaves, and poor people had, like, their clothing had actual value, even when they had no rights and they had no citizenship, and in many cases had no freedom, that their clothing was actually a source of power. So, you know, I never know on any given day what I'm going to open up and start reading. And sometimes it's food history, sometimes it's foreign relations. I have just published a book that anybody can get right now called Rethinking American Grand Strategy. That is a collection of about 40 different or 30 different scholars who are all presenting perspectives on American power, where it's been historically and where it's going, and what grand strategy should be in the 21st century. And that includes public health, that includes race, it includes many things that traditionally are not studied as part of foreign relations, at least in the sort of, you know, great power sense that it has been studied in terms of war and leadership. So I think that would be something that, even though I'm not working on it right now, it's just come out and I think some people may enjoy it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, just recently in the headlines, and of course, for those that may not know, NATO has just identified regardless of where you fall out on this discussion, NATO has just identified climate change as a security, an element to their security strategy. And so has the current administration, and the Department of Defense has said climate change is now one of its top priorities. So, you know, it's one of those things that one doesn't typically associate with, even if wherever you fall out on the spectrum of that discussion, you don't typically associate with foreign policy or international relations, but it very much is now that type of thing. But well, thank you. So I meant to mention at the beginning that this is not a Zoom background. I'm actually in my car because I've got to go back into work for a meeting at 11 o'clock. And I wanted to let everybody know that they are welcome to type questions into your field, which should appear at the top of your Zoom screen. And then at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Howard Ehrlich, who will kind of take the question and answer session from here. But I will say that I did see one comment pop up on the screen while we were doing the chat that admired your Theodore Roosevelt in the background there, Susan. So,
Well, thank you for noticing. I wish I could. I see this comment saying that I knitted him. I did not, but he's available from the Unemployed Philosophers Guild, and you can get a Little Thinker Theodore Roosevelt, which someone actually bought for me. So I wish I could take the compliment, but you can get your own.
all right, Howard. So over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Greg. A great job as usual. So let's start. We have a number of questions here, and Jack, we're going to put you on the spot. Okay, these are good members, and they know what they're talking about, I think. So let's go to it. The first question is, how would TR deal with China today?
Okay, so the professional historian in me wants to begin by saying you can't do that. You can't extrapolate the person of Theodore Roosevelt from his time period and plop him down in the second century of the third century of the third decade of the 21st century and say this is what he would do. That said, of course, we can try to think a little bit creatively about this. I think that TR would have tried to do a couple of different things at the same time. On the one hand, he was a staunch believer in kind of free market democratic values. And so he would have been alarmed by kind of the difference in the systems in the West, political systems in the West and the Chinese political system. On the other hand, he was very pragmatic as a diplomatist, and was I think pretty intelligent about not allowing his ideas and his ideals to cloud his judgment as to kind of geopolitical realities. So I think that he would have approached China with quite a bit of wariness, but also in a pragmatic fashion. As in other words, this is by some measures the world's largest economy already, second most populous country in the world. We have to work with them. So how do we maintain a constructive relationship where possible?
Okay. Another question is, I will phrase this correctly. Mr. Shaw said this. He said something about TR's use of iron policy. Whether you know this, there's a book, by the way, he actually cites here, Diplomacy of
Velvet on Iron.
Yeah, exactly. He says, any thoughts on this velvet iron concept in foreign policy?
So, I mean, I think that's just kind of it's title from a famous book about TR's foreign relations by Frederick Marx III. I mean, I think it's just kind of an elegant way of encapsulating what I said just a moment ago about TR and China. It's basically this idea that, know what your interests are, pursue them unabashedly. But the work of diplomacy is long and slow, and often, you're accepting kind of, half of what you want, or only part of what you want, it's not always satisfying, but that's the way diplomacy works.
Understand. Another question was, how would you evaluate TR's role of the Treaty of Portsmouth at the end of the Russo-Japanese War?
It's a very specific question. Yeah, so it's interesting. I ultimately didn't write very much about that in the book. I mentioned it in passing, but it was one of the things that I thought, one of the episodes that I thought about actually turning into a case study, and I didn't for a variety of reasons. One of which was a lot of what actually happened behind the scenes wasn't known by the public. It was really done behind closed doors, and so there wasn't as much of a kind of a public opinion or domestic political angle to this kind of crucial foreign policy episode to really be worth exploring for the purposes of my book. So yeah, I mean, it was incredibly skillful diplomacy. It was absolutely essential, bringing together two great powers, Japan and Russia, who were at war, and trying to figure out how to get them to stop shooting at each other. And along the way, maintain a balance of power, which TR believed was ultimately in the interest of the US. And he succeeded.
No, good. Another question is, what was the relationship between TR and William Randolph Hearst?
TR loved newspapers and journalists and editors, but he truly, deeply despised Hearst. It was one of the things that comes across most clearly in both in his private correspondence and in kind of what he said in public. And he considered Hearst's newspapers to be one of the most pernicious influences in US political culture. And Hearst didn't think that highly of TR either.
Right. Another question is, do you think TR would handle the Navy today in current conditions?
I think he would be absolutely fascinated by kind of the nature of modern navies. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with the US Navy now as it tries to figure out its role in what people kind of commonly think of as it's kind of the Asian century, trying to figure out what role the US Navy should play as the US kind of tries to figure out its relationship with China. I think he would have been, down in the weeds, becoming a real expert on all kinds of different aspects. The Navy now is even more far more complicated. I mean, it was already complicated then, it's far more complicated now. And I think he would have, if he were president today, he would play a big role in pushing for a smarter, more modern Navy.
Okay. Next question is, how would you rank TR of all our presidents in dealing with foreign policy?
I think it's, you can always say this one was a little better, that one was a little bit better, but he's certainly in the top five. I think, and that's not just my opinion. I mean, when you look at kind of surveys of historians, he always comes in the top five. I mean, there's no question about that. There are very few other presidents who had his skill in the foreign policy area.
Gotcha. Another question is, how would TR favor NATO as it exists today?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting kind of aspects of the last decade of his career is he was trying to figure out how to strike a balance between protecting US interests and making sure that kind of US interests always came first in US foreign policy, but also recognizing that the US needed partnerships. The US didn't have any firm alliances at that point, but recognizing that the US needed strong partnerships to be able to protect its interests. And behind the scenes, he did a lot to bring the US and Great Britain closer together. And one of the fascinating things that I had a chance to write about in the final chapter of my book was the role he played in behind the scenes in trying to help British policymakers during World War I more effectively make their case to the US public, because Great Britain was very controversial for tens of millions of Americans. And he provided often unsolicited advice to British policymakers as to what they should be doing, kind of very, very granular things, specific reports they should be highlighting, specific people they should talk to, because he viewed the relationship between the US and Great Britain as absolutely essential, both to kind of US interests, but also to kind of global stability.
Do you think TR liked the idea of the League of Nations?
That's one of the last big, maybe the last big kind of debate of his career. So TR is a bit difficult to pin down on this question. He, on the one hand, he was really the first prominent US policymaker to suggest the creation of something along the League of Nations. On the other hand, he was wary of allowing the US to cede too much sovereignty to some kind of League of Nations. I think one of the arguments I make in my book, and it's speculation, but one of the arguments I make toward the end of the book is that if TR had not died when he did, he would have very likely been elected president to succeed Woodrow Wilson, and would have succeeded where Wilson failed in steering the US into membership of the League of Nations.
Interesting. By the way, it's a separate question here, like, guess, how do the Dutch, by the way, view US foreign policy today?
Well, that's what I'm knee deep in that every single day for my work. So the Dutch, I mean, overall, the Dutch are fascinated by the US. I mean, if you turn on Dutch television, you get lots of American television shows in the original English with Dutch subtitles. So the average Dutch person is deeply steeped in kind of US political culture, or US popular culture in general. I mean, in terms of Dutch foreign policy, both the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Dutch Ministry of Defense, I mean, they view the US as kind of this single, maybe a key pillar, certainly a key pillar of Dutch security, of helping to protect Dutch interests. The Dutch, or the Netherlands, is the world's second largest exporter of agro-food products after the US. So, I mean, there's a ton of back and forth trade. I mean, US-Dutch ties are very, very close. I mean, we spend an hour just talking about that. There's been, I mean, I guess I have to say, you know, there's been some concern in the last few years about kind of certain aspects of US foreign policy, which I don't need to go into. But I mean, even during kind of some of the more kind of low points over the last couple of years, I mean, Dutch-US relations are still very, very close.
Okay, I think I have two more questions for you here. So, would TR have done something differently or negotiated differently with the Treaty of Versailles? In other words, would he have done anything specifically there in that treaty that you think he would have done differently?
And again, the professional historian in me is loath to kind of take on that kind of counterfactual. It's hard to say. I mean, TR was, I think, in many ways, he wasn't necessarily a shrewder politician than Wilson. I think he was probably a shrewder negotiator. I think he was probably a bit more pragmatic and a bit more kind of wily. That said, I mean, TR, I think, in some ways became less flexible toward the end of his career. So it's, I mean, it's really, I guess I want to say that he would have maybe handled it a little bit better than Wilson, but who knows?
Right. Was TR, in your mind, a classic imperialist?
Imperialism is another one of those loaded phrases that I'm always reluctant to pick up. I mean, kind of in a kind of a value neutral sense, TR was absolutely and kind of an enthusiastic imperialist, because that's what, I mean, imperialism was a very normal mainstream aspect of not just US political culture, excuse me, US thinking about foreign policy, but thinking about foreign policy in all of the great powers. It was normal back then. There were, excuse me, there were certainly anti-imperialists in the US. However, they were not necessarily anti-imperialists for the reason that we would think of anti-imperialism today. Apologies. Frog in my throat.
Yes, and of course, I'll leave with this question today. What is your next project that you're working on?
So you never know when a project is going to take off and when it's going to start and then die off. Right now, I'm starting to think about the links between domestic political culture and foreign policy, especially in the area of thinking about US decline after the Cold War. So post kind of late 1940s. We'll see if it takes off.
Okay, Very good. Well, we've had you on for a long time here. Okay. And Susan, by the way, there was a question for you. Somebody asked you about your little doll back there. Did you make it yourself?
Did not. If I could pitch something that's not an Oxford University Press product, Unemployed Philosophers Guild has lots of great stuff. And one of the things they make are little thinker dolls. And somebody got it for me. So you can go to the Unemployed Philosophers Guild and you can get your very own PR finger puppet, I believe, one of these dolls. And then they have other things. But as was said at the very beginning, I live on Long Island. I grew up going to Sagamore Hill on school trips. I had the opportunity to spend time working with Sue Sarna and Amy Verone at Sagamore Hill, and people who know me well know that a TR doll would never be unwelcome.
That's right. By the way, being right here in Oyster Bay, a stone's throw from Oyster Bay, from Sagamore Hill. Anytime you and Jack, if you'd like to come to Sagamore Hill, when it opens up, we'll give you a personal tour. How about that?
Thanks, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, your book. And Susan, thank you also for appearing. On behalf of our president and chairman of the board, Admiral Archicel, and myself, I'd like to thank, and of course, Greg, who did a great job with this. And Dave back there did a fantastic job he's Mr. Zoom. We call him Mr. Zoom. Did a great job. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you back again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.